Thanks for taking the time to download this BBC Radio 5 Live podcast. To search for other podcasts you might like, click bbc.co.uk/5live, where you'll also find our terms of use.
Hello, my name's Adrian Goldberg. Thank you for downloading the 5 Live Investigates podcast. This week, the police officers taking advantage of vulnerable victims of crime for sex. We'll hear from women who'd survived rape or domestic violence, only to be abused again by the officers sent to help them. And complaints about rogue driving instructors running at almost 3 a week. Good morning. On 5 Live Investigates today, vulnerable victims of crime preyed upon by the police they turn to for help. We're talking about women who'd already been subjected to rape and domestic abuse, who were then sexually exploited by the people who were supposed to be there to help them. We'll be revealing the most accurate figures so far published on this disturbing subject, and hearing about one police officer allowed to remain in his job despite abusing his professional position, who went on to do it again. Sally Chesworth has been investigating this for us. And Sally, this comes under a category known as abuse of powers for sexual gain.
Yes, and these are cases where officers have been accused of using their professional role to develop an inappropriate relationship with someone who was vulnerable. That may be a victim of crime, a witness, or someone they encounter in the course of their job. The level of abuse varies from sexually suggestive texting right up to grooming and sleeping with a victim, often when they're isolated and feel they've no one to turn to.
So how often is it happening?
Well, we can't say for certain, especially given that many people who've been exploited by officers in this way might be unwilling to trust the police again and make a complaint. But for the first time, we do have some figures which give an insight into the extent of the problem. The Independent Police Complaints Commission, which looks at the most serious complaints about the police in England and Wales, only started recording this as a specific category in 2014, when it recorded 73 cases. After checking records manually for us for the 3 years prior to that, they say they've identified a further 86 cases. So that makes a total of 159 referrals for abuse of power for sexual gain in the last 4 years.
Now, those figures are for referrals to the IPCC only, but as we'll hear, it's not clear how many of those complaints were eventually upheld, or indeed how many were dealt with by the police locally before reaching the IPCC, which aren't included in those figures. But let's hear from someone with experience of this, a woman who wants to be known as Claire from the Midlands. She'd contacted West Mercia Police with concerns for herself and her children after suffering domestic abuse at the hands of her husband. PC Jordan Powell got involved in her case. To protect Claire's anonymity, someone else has voiced her words.
He phoned me to say that he'd been given the case to arrest my husband. I later found out that he had actually manipulated his way onto that case.
Tell me about how your meetings with him developed then over time.
I had to get a non-molestation order and an occupancy order, just so that my children could actually come back into the home. We legally needed an escort back into the premises, because nobody knew where he was and the police had a duty of care. Powell then arranged to contact me on my mobile, because obviously I was not in my home, to arrange a safe time to meet him and to escort me and my children back to the premises. He texted me on the Sunday morning to say this is his number. I presumed it was a police works mobile and arranged to meet him to get myself and the children back into the home. I thought he was doing his job and that he was being caring.
How did he persuade you to have a relationship?
I think it took quite a while really for this to build up, because initially he would text me, which again I still thought was the police mobile, that he was just seeing if me and my children were okay, if there was anything we needed. And then he basically told me, I've got my own personal police officer. I kind of took that as a joke at first, until he told me that he needed to put a smile on my face, which I did question. And then he asked if he could come round and see if we were okay before he started his shift. In the back of my head, I was thinking it was a bit strange. But if you do care and you are committed to your job, then maybe this is what police officers do. So it did take a while, but he did build up that trust. He was in his uniform and I trusted him because he was in his uniform. He's not going to abuse that power because he's a police officer.
And he sent you texts?
All day long sometimes.
A relationship did developed with him, a personal relationship. How did you feel about the fact that you were now in a relationship with an officer who had originally been sent to deal with you on a professional basis?
At first, I felt it was a bit of a boost, you know. I hadn't had it happen for years after suffering domestic abuse. I hadn't had the attention. And the attention and the compliments was what I was craving, and he knew that. It quickly turned into he would control the situation. I had to text him until he got in touch, and then he would be in control and give me a time, and we'd have to stick to that. It would be all on his terms. I started to panic, really, thinking he got every detail about me, and no one's going to believe me. He could stop me in my car, and I could be done for anything, and I've got nowhere to turn.
So alarm bells were ringing?
Yes, they were, yeah. I couldn't approach the police because I felt they wouldn't believe me. Who are they going to believe, me or the police officer?
There's a irony here, isn't there, in that you were seeking protection from an incredibly controlling and abusive relationship, and the man who was sent by the police to help you get out of that situation, in turn, ended up having an extremely controlling relationship with you.
Yeah, definitely. I did feel really stupid. How can you fall for it twice? It took lots of hard work on my behalf to accept, actually, I'm not the one in the wrong here.
So, Sally, a point of extreme vulnerability in her life. Claire is groomed for a relationship by the police officer sent to help her. He makes her feel special. He uses his own personal mobile phone to text her rather than the police phone. He makes increasingly suggestive comments. And it emerged this wasn't the first time PC Powell had behaved like this.
No, it wasn't. Claire says she felt trapped in the relationship and repeatedly tried to end it, but she only reported PC Powell when the police approached her. They'd caught Powell in a sting operation after receiving a complaint of assault from another woman he'd dealt with on duty. It then emerged that 4 years earlier he'd admitted having a relationship with yet another crime victim that he'd met in the course of an investigation. On that occasion, PC Powell was given a formal warning about his conduct but not sacked.
Yeah, so he had a history of this kind of behaviour, but he was still allowed to remain in the force and still allowed to deal with a vulnerable victim of abuse like Claire, who told me how she felt when she found out about his past.
I'm infuriated. I didn't find this out until I commissioned a solicitor to fight my case, and he actually found this out for me. I can't believe that they've allowed someone to continue to practice with vulnerable women when they already know that they've got some sort of problem with women, and now they've caused so much emotional upset. If they just sacked him, none of us would have had to suffer. I felt the whole of the police force knew it was me. I felt they were all laughing about me. Every time I saw a police car, I was completely freaked out. It's known that people who abuse have a pattern. It isn't a one-off, it's a pattern. And the police of all people, with their training, should know this. So why were they not supervising him? Why was he allowed to learn work? If he had to do the job, why not send him with another police officer?
You seem still now to be quite raw and emotional about your treatment at the hands of the police, not just Jordan Powell, but the police overall.
Yes, definitely. I remain angry because they still haven't recognised the damage. I'm suing them for it. I'm 4 years down the line and they're allowing that to go to court, even though they've admitted liability, and there's no reason they can't settle out of court. It would cost them less money, but no, rubbing salt in the wounds, as I see it. This is the worst experience I've been through in my life, and I think the police need to learn lessons.
That's Claire's story. As you've heard there, a legal battle is still ongoing. PC Powell was convicted in 2013 after West Mercia police carried out an undercover sting operation following a complaint by another woman. He was jailed for 15 months after admitting misconduct in public office. Let's speak to Solicitor Ian Gould, who's representing Claire and other women in similar cases. Good morning to you, Ian.
Good morning.
Just picking up on what we heard Claire say there, what lessons do you think the police need to learn from incidents like this?
Well, I think there's a number of issues that come to fore. First of all, is the fact that having had the confidence to step forward and give evidence, victims are often very critical of the lack of support from the police thereafter. And in my experience, victims are offered either little or no counselling and support. In Claire's case, she was given a telephone number to ring. Another woman I represent, nothing at all. In my opinion, the police should be far more proactive in trying to help these victims once they're identified. Furthermore, victims complain of being kept in the dark as to what's happening as regards the investigation and the process. And this makes the women feel only more isolated and stranded, which in turn is then exacerbated by delay. In one case I'm involved in, it took 2.5 years from when the victim was first interviewed to the officer's disciplinary hearing, at which he was then dismissed. What I find most shocking is the apparent lack of supervision. In Claire's case, it's evident that much of PC Powell's abusive behaviour took place whilst he was on duty and in uniform. I find it surprising that none of his colleagues or supervisors noted or reported his behaviour. For example, he's volunteering to respond to domestic incidents, going beyond what could be construed as professional behaviour. The indication is that he and other officers, similarly accused, are able to act with impunity.
To be fair, in Claire's case, though, West Mercia Police did go to the length of an undercover sting operation to trap him following a complaint from another woman who'd said she'd been a victim of crime. And it's that sting operation that led to the case coming out into the open. So they weren't just standing by and letting him get away with it.
Yes, but let's not forget that PC Powell had a previous similar misconduct finding against him in 2008. But nevertheless was still serving. It appears then that West Mercia Force either knew that there was a risk of him abusing his power, or they took no appropriate action to prevent him from serving and to protecting women to whom he posed a risk. It appears no steps whatsoever beyond that bare misconduct finding were taken to ensure that PC Powell would be prevented from abusing his powers. Frankly, it beggars belief that PC Powell was permitted not only to serve, but to deal with vulnerable victims of domestic abuse on his own, taking into account his history. Obviously,
in any industry, in any profession, there will be bad apples, as it were. Is there something the police, as an industry, as a group of people, can learn from cases like Claire's that might help prevent the risk of those bad apples getting to people like Claire?
Yeah, I mean, I think that each case that comes to light represents an opportunity for the police to learn. Police forces, like other professionals in positions of power, have a responsibility to do everything possible to prevent such abuse, deal with it effectively as soon as it's identified, and learn lessons from it.
Ian Gould, thanks very much indeed for your time. Let's hear now from Detective Superintendent Gary Watson. He's head of professional standards at West Mercia Police, the police force involved in Claire's case. What's his reaction to the behaviour of PC Powell?
The way that Jordan Powell behaved was criminal. The way that Jordan Powell behaved breached our code of ethics and our standards of professional behaviour. And we took great steps to ensure that we were able to deal with the offending that he was undertaking.
If you expect the highest standards from your officers, why wasn't Jordan Powell sacked in 2008 when he admitted to having a sexual relationship with someone who had contacted the police, an ordinary member of the public who could be perceived to be vulnerable?
The situation was that he received a disciplinary sanction for that, but it wasn't dismissed, as you say.
Why not?
That decision was based upon the circumstances of the incident going back to 2008, and that was the decision that was taken at that time based on the information available.
Was it a mistake?
I don't think I can say it's a mistake, but what we do know is that he did moderate his behaviour after that. We became aware of information that was the case, and based upon those concerns starting to surface again, he was the subject of a proactive investigation by our anti-corruption unit.
Did West Mercia Police take any steps to ensure that vulnerable women might be protected from him?
He was deployed into a different area. He was the subject of ongoing supervision. It's impossible to totally remove an operational officer from dealing with vulnerable members of the community because they will be coming across them no matter what role they're doing. As soon as there became any suggestion that he was behaving in a similar way again, then that full proactive investigation took place. He was arrested and, as you know, subsequently convicted by the court.
Sure, but I suppose it begs the question then of how closely, in reality, he was supervised.
Obviously, officers that were supervising him and managing him were aware of the previous concerns, and to ensure that he was always constantly supervised 4 years after the original matter was probably not proportionate. But once those concerns were raised, then action was taken very quickly, very robustly.
But you were, to borrow a phrase, shutting the stable door after the horse had bolted, hadn't you? And if Powell had been sacked after the first incident, then his other victims would not have been abused by Powell.
Clearly, if he wasn't a serving police officer, then he probably wouldn't have met those individuals. So, yes, but what I'm very clear on is the fact that he did face the full power of the law. He's been dismissed from the service. Jordan Powell has no place in West Mercia Police or any other police service in this country.
That's Detective Superintendent Gary Watson from West Mercia Police. Coming up, the specialist officer who used the medical records of a rape victim to groom and take advantage of her. And getting your comments to what you're hearing as well. You can text us on 85058, email goldberg@bbc.co.uk, or on Twitter, we're at BBC5Live.
On DAB Digital Radio, digital TV, downloads and online.
This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
5 Live Investigates with Adrian Goldberg.
On 5 Live Investigates this morning, the vulnerable victims of crime taken advantage of by the police sent to help them. We're talking about officers responding to cases of rape, domestic abuse and the like, who prey on the women who needed their help and support. Been getting your calls and comments on this as well with our reporter Sally Chesworth. What are people saying, Sal?
Well, there's a message coming from Ben Edgerton. He's saying what's worse is the covering up that takes place. Funny how serious cases involving police officers never really get any coverage.
And Smudge says in all walks of life there are Egypts. Just because someone gives them a uniform doesn't mean they will change. Keep your comments coming. Drop us a text to 85058. Email goldberg@bbc.co.uk. On Twitter, we're at BBC5Live. Now, we heard earlier, Sally, that the police watchdog, the IPCC, has had 159 referrals over the last 4 years for these type of cases. So when complaints are upheld, what action is taken against officers?
We just don't know. There's no central record of outcomes in these cases. Sometimes they're handed back to the officer's home force to deal with. So the IPCC don't record what eventually happens. Sometimes these cases won't be referred to the IPCC at all, but will be dealt with locally. All the IPCC could tell us is that action was taken in cases involving 4 officers.
So just so I understand this right then, 159 cases were referred to the Independent Police Complaints Commission, but they could only tell us about action taken against 4 officers.
That's right. And what's even more striking is that they couldn't tell us about a single case which resulted in criminal proceedings. The Scottish equivalent of the IPCC tells us it doesn't keep records about this at all.
OK, so what happened to the 4 that we know about in England and Wales?
2 officers were dismissed. 1 received management advice and another resigned prior to a disciplinary hearing. Now, it is possible that individual police forces will also have taken action locally, but it's just not known in how many cases.
And because of this lack of recording, it is very difficult then to assess just how effectively this is being dealt with by the police.
Yes, what we can say from the cases that we've looked at is that there is a pattern of male police officers targeting women who were particularly isolated or vulnerable because they were the victims of domestic abuse or even sexual assault. They put their trust in the investigating officer, only to find that trust betrayed.
Let's hear now about Evie. That's not her real name. Evie has a history of depression and self-harm. She told the Metropolitan Police that she had been raped. One of the officers assigned to investigate her case was Detective Sergeant Robert Dawson. To preserve her anonymity, someone else has voiced her words.
It was extremely difficult to approach the police. It took me months to come forward because I was terrified that they wouldn't believe me or would think that it was my fault.
What were your first impressions of Dawson?
I was relieved when he believed me. He really seemed to want to fight for me.
How did he gain your trust?
For the investigation, he gathered my medical records and the emails I'd written trying to come to terms with what had happened. And after he had them, he spoke with me and asked me if my self-harming was related to a previous abusive relationship, which he must have seen in the evidence. He said that he could see I hadn't had a lot of support and seemed to feel alone and unable to talk to anyone. I'd always thought that if people knew about my depression, that they wouldn't like me or help me, so it was a huge relief when he seemed to still want to. He repeatedly told